in the broadest possible sense. And so it's valid.
I'll try a medium map on Expert.
That's a very difficult thing to say because generally
how I go.
We're not very good at looking at
it's a bit hit and miss because sometimes
patterns as objective reality. We tend to have to reduce things.
It really kind of sometimes can depend on
your
surrounding area and where you start and things. Not all the time. Most of the time it's pretty good, but sometimes you'll have like
abstraction. You know, like
guys around like surrounding your castle that you just.
It's not unreasonable.
Unfortunately, you just can't get through for ages.
There's a characteristic pattern of behavior that moves you up or down a hierarchy. It's not unrealistic to assume that we would be able to note when we're partaking of that or observing it or violating it. That's conscience, as far as I can tell. And it isn't unreasonable to note that our perceptions of that might be accurate. Now, what that means metaphysically, see, I don't understand that either, because human beings are unbelievably complicated. We have the most complicated nervous systems that there are. Our brains are the most complex structures that we know of, except for other brains. So we are the most complex thing that we know of. And so we're a pinnacle of sorts. And I'm not saying that evolution is driving towards that pinnacle, but in terms of cognitive elaboration, it has. So is the ideal form of that is it unreasonable to propose that the ideal form of that complexity is divine? The universe has been aiming at it since day one in some sense.
Well, so the universe has not been aiming at it as far as I can tell. What it does is tend towards something. It tends toward a kind of stability. And what you're arguing, I hear some things in it.
Well, I didn't want to smuggle in a too overt teleology, but, here we are and everything. We actually did emerge. So... And it's not obvious what to make of that. It could have been otherwise. You can say that, but it wasn't. So,
right. So here we are, and I think what I get from what you're saying, and the part I agree with is that I think people like both you and me are too used to having to argue that these patterns are adaptive and therefore entitled to a whole host of defenses that they are not generally given, or at least they are entitled to leeway to be evaluated on honorable grounds rather than castigated for the fact that they don't match up with experiment or something along those lines. I do think...
Or desire.
Inexcusable that's thing of all. That's pretty handy. Inexhaustible.
The thing that I don't hear in what you're saying,
carnivore.
The bitter pill here, is that ultimately, or maybe not, I won't say ultimately, but historically, the genes have been in charge every step of the way. That is to say, all of the stuff that we do above the gene level, all of the cultural stuff, all of the conscious stuff, has been in service of the genes. And that's unfortunate, but...
no, there is a flaw in that. I thought about that. Well... Look, in human beings, increasingly, consciousness structures the mechanism that selects the genes. Mm-hmm. So here's an example. Let's say, I'll see if I can get this right. So imagine, for example, that you live in a hunter-gatherer troop, and you have a great hunter in your midst. And he's great for two reasons. One is that he can hunt, but the other reason is that he shares. And so that makes him a really great hunter. And so you elevate his status.
That's not bad.
Now you elevate his status. It's
being
like
model there in the first week is not bad at all.
Now the price you pay for that is a reduction, at least on one level, of your own biological fitness, because by elevating him up the hierarchy, you increase the probability that he's going to be chosen as a mate. Now, the benefit of that, however, is that, you get to eat and you don't die. So, but my point here is that by that continual voting on what constitutes competence and the arrangement of those hierarchies, our conscious minds have structured the landscape that actually selects. So men vote on which men are likely to mate. And then the women compete for access to that victor. And so both men and women are behaving in a manner that privileges certain kinds of genetic manifestations. And so the consciousness is shaping the genes as much as the genes are shaping the consciousness.
The consciousness is in control of the behavior, but it is subservient to the objective of the genes. And unfortunately, I think the situation is that you've been handed a feeble toolkit by evolutionary biologists and are trying to make sense of the world as if it was higher quality than it is. So I don't want to drag you or our viewers too deeply into the weeds here. But my claim is that my field is divided between two camps that are incorrect. One camp are the kin selectionists, right? People who view this as narrowly genetic. These are my intellectual ancestors. And the other group are the group selectionists who have understood something else, which is that essentially altruism pays, and there are certain places you can stand that it appears that that is a driving evolutionary force, whereas mathematically it is very difficult to make a robust model of this sort, at least not a realistic one. My point would be the kin selectionists have understood one part of the logic correctly, but they've instantiated it too narrowly. The group selectionists have found a fiction, but just as we were describing 15 minutes ago, that fiction has actually given them license to explore a very fertile piece of evolutionary territory, which is the landscape of cultural evolution, right? Cultural evolution does not make a tremendous amount of sense through the narrowest kin-selected lens. It makes a great deal of sense through the group-selected lens, but the gateway is fictional. And so
I think you have to bring that down to earth more before I can completely follow what you're.
Yeah.
I'm going to harass you about critiquing my specific point after that. Anyway.
Okay. Good.
But so I'm trying to follow. But I some examples would probably help me make sure I'm following you.
Let's take your example and let's put it into what I think the right way of resolving this conflict in evolutionary biology is. So I would argue that the right way of viewing this is something called lineage selection. Now, a lineage is an individual and all of that individual's descendants. Okay? And my point is that is actually a valid target of evolution. Lineages can evolve just the same way individuals can evolve. So we can see adaptation at the lineage level, which will look like, if you don't pay close enough attention to what you're looking at, it may look like group evolution, which is in part why the group selectionists have gotten themselves confused. But here's the point. Let's take your hunter-gatherer band and the case of the individual male who is an excellent hunter and is also valued by his male companions because he shares, and therefore his status in the group provides some increased likelihood of mating, which could be taken as an evolutionary loss from the point of view of his male competitors inside of his band. But I would argue
Behemoth should scare the shit out of them.
The reason is this. Let's think about this band if everybody took a narrow view of their own contribution to the next generation, right? If all the males did was try to leave as many genes in the next generation as possible by whatever means necessary, right? That's a band full of conflict, right? Now, if we look across the larger landscape, all of the bands of hunter-gatherers, how much does the competition between two individuals within one band over mates affect how many copies of their genes are on that larger landscape? And the answer is almost not at all, right? That is to say, you can have 10 offspring to some other individual's 2, right? And you might think that you'd beaten them by a factor of 5. But there are two problems with this. One, if you are closely related to him, then a lot of what we narrowly in the the traditional kin-selected view would regard as a loss to you is actually insignificant compared to the larger landscape. But the other thing is, if your band blinks out of existence 5 generations down the road, taking all of your great-great-great-great-grand offspring, right? If it takes all those people with him, then you have not succeeded. The advantage you got within one generation is completely erased by the loss of the population within which you were embedded. So the point is, if we really understood the mindset of the individual in rational evolutionary terms, we would understand that they, in some sense, will be built. They will be wired and programmed to behave in such a way, both to advance their own genetic interests and to protect the long-term population well-being that allows those genes to circulate, right? They will effectively be protecting a gene pool. Now, the group selectionists will jump and they will say, aha, you've done it. You've said that groups are valid. And I will say, no, it is not the group. It is a lineage. It is the lineage protecting itself through the individual that is responsible for the adaptation here. You can dismiss it as a group, but that's like saying that I threw a frisbee.
What practical difference do you think that makes in relationship to what are the implications of that view compared to the implications of a group selection viewpoint?
Well, they're subtly distinct, but I would argue in the end decisive. So, for example, if you take the group selection view and you do not recognize the game theoretic instability at its core, then you may struggle to find a formulation of Marxism, for example, that realizes the full benefits of human cooperation, not realizing that the structure you build will be inherently unstable and that you have to actually correct for that instability, which will either happen through brutality, which you don't want, right? Or you will have to architect something much closer to what Elinor Ostrom discovered in her Nobel Prize-winning work about the way indigenous peoples do this very job. So I guess the point is the group selection, I would argue, is a temporary misunderstanding of lineage selection, but it does a good enough job to allow those who are involved in thinking in a group-selected way to see human cultural evolution for what it is. And that's where the payoff comes. And so my point is we can now go back, having found human cultural evolution, which is where the heavy lifting is done, we can now go back and correct the group-selected viewpoint, and we can make it rigorous by looking at it as a lineage phenomenon, not a group phenomenon. And we have then a continuous understanding, which then we've gotten super complicated here, and I wish we hadn't. But I will point out, though, that the upshot of this, from my perspective, is the genes have been in charge all along. They have acted through consciousness. They have acted through culture. But those things have been subordinate to genetic objectives. But now that we have consciousness, we can look at what it is that genes would have us do, and we can actually take them out of that control position. And we must, because they contain things like programs for genocide and warfare that we must sideline if we're going to survive. So having arrived at an understanding of what we are actually built for, we now have to turn the tables on the genes, which is not easy, but I also don't think it's impossible.
Okay, so I'm going to branch out two ways there. There's no objections to the argument that you laid out come into my mind, and it's obviously something you've thought about a lot, and I can't spin up a hypothesis about lineage selection versus group selection sort of on the cuff. I would say, however, that it isn't clear to me how that argument, independent of its validity, is related to my original proposition that it's misleading in some sense to think of the genes more in charge than the consciousness. They're looping with one another because consciousness is in fact making choices about what constitutes those that will be elected to the status of more likely maters. And so that doesn't have any detrimental effect, as far as I'm concerned, on the idea of genetic. I'm not trying to devalue the power of genes across time at all, but if consciousness is selecting the mechanism that selects, then it's definitely altering the probability that genes are going to propagate across time. I would say your lineage argument, in some sense, actually likely makes that case more strongly, because look, one of the things I outlined in Beyond Order, I touched on it a little bit in the previous book, was the idea that, you know, an action, you undertake an action to gain a particular goal in a particular framework of time. So all of your actions are bounded in space and time. You don't want it to take forever, and you don't want it to occupy everywhere, right? So you're operating locally, but you have to operate locally in a way, and this is like the lineage idea, in a way that doesn't disturb your next local action or the one after that. You have to think about your action now, its consequences immediately, its consequences in a day, a week, a month, a year, and that shades off forever. And so an optimal action is one that takes you where you want to go now, but doesn't interfere with your ability to get to where you want to go in the future, or maybe even makes that easier. And so you could say we're sophisticated enough so that we not only look for patterns of behavior to admire that work now, but we look for patterns of behavior that work now in a way that isn't compromising the future. And that's why, for example, I think that we admire and track reciprocity. And that's obviously something you're interested in as someone who worked with Trivers. We track reciprocity unbelievably well. And I would say that's at least in part because reciprocity is a game that sustains itself across time. And that's actually a place where you can see our eye to the future operating. If I do you a favor and you don't return it, you're not trustworthy over the long run. I can't rely on you. And so I'm not going to afford you any benefits, evolutionarily or otherwise. So any flaws in that you see?
No, I would say that there's another rung to that ladder. So as an undergraduate, I worked with Trivers, and reciprocity was obviously a key feature of his contribution to the field. My graduate advisor, Dick Alexander, contributed the idea of indirect reciprocity, in which typically mediated through things like reputation. It does not have to be repaid by the individual for whom you've done the service. And of course, this actually underlies the evolution of economic systems and the like. But I want to go back to the question you asked me about whether or not the genes are not, in fact, in some ways subject to the consciousness. There's a limited way in which that is true. Clearly, the genes exist in an environment in which the consciousness has a great deal of say over what the genes get to do. But here's the problem. Let's take it away from people for a second so that we can see this clearly. The genes of a spider exist in all of the spider's cells, incapable of doing anything, exerting any force on the world whatsoever, except through the spider. So you might say that actually the body of the spider is in some ways in charge of the gene's well-being, and that's true. But if you had a group of spiders that woke up to the fact that their bodies were in fact in charge and that their genes couldn't force them to do anything, and those spiders decided instead of investing in spider ecology stuff, they were going to invest in spider hedonism, right? Something like that, so that the spiders were just doing what their bodies felt like doing and not what their genes wanted them doing, which is to spread those genes. Then those individual spiders would indeed be in control. They could do exactly what they wanted. But what would happen is those spiders that made that decision would fail to pass on their genes, and 2 spider generations later, they would be gone. And the spiders that we...
Well, I would certainly... I'm thinking of a bidirectional effect, obviously. I mean, it's clear, I think you're absolutely right, that consciousness can make decisions that are going to put genetic evolution to a halt.
What I'm saying, actually, is that we must do that if we are to survive, but I believe it is the most difficult puzzle human beings have ever faced. We have to turn the tables on the genes, and we have to actually say, look...
I think they just said ancient behemoths times 5 plus 5.
The most amazing computational machinery in the known universe. They also awarded us the ability to pursue and appreciate beauty, to be compassionate. They awarded us all of those things as a means to a narrow genetic end, a very uninteresting one. And the point is, now that we have consciousness and we do appreciate beauty and we can be compassionate and we appreciate people who have good characteristics, we have to look at what we're programmed for and say, actually, no, the machine is capable of something honorable, whereas the genetic objective is actually 100% identical to the genetic objective of every other creature with genes. That is to say, the capacity of a human being is spectacular. It is unrivaled. But the purpose of a human being is no different than the purpose of a liver fluke or an oak tree or a malaria particle. It's to pass on its genes. And given that we can now see that we don't want to be advancing our genetic interest, because frankly, that's not a defensible goal, but we do honor the things that our machine is capable of, we have to place those things at a higher position in the hierarchy. And the critical part, the difficult part, is we have to do that without giving an advantage to people who refused to give up the genetic program as their primary objective.
God, you know, I feel like I'm caught in a modern incarnation of the arguments between Freud and Jung.
Is that right?
Yes, because
I'm not playing Freud's role.
Yes,
am I?
I think you are.
Oh, terrible!
It's not an insult by any stretch of the imagination. But what I hear is genes as id.
Well,
let me just walk through the analogy and tell me what you think. Genes as id and superego as control mechanism. So what you see in Freud continually is the idea that base impulses have to be inhibited, and that's actually the primary function of civilization. And, you know, the brain is an inhibitory mechanism in large part. And so there's a neurological rationale for that. We shut off many things all the time. They're lurking and ready to leap forth, but they're inhibited. But there's two ways of thinking about such things as the regulation of aggression. We can work with aggression and sexuality. They come together. We started with rape. They come together very well there. So, do you inhibit aggression? Do you inhibit sexuality? Or do you spin them together with a variety of other impulses and make them into like a dynamic and harmonic game where they have their say, where you have access to their force, but they're not manifest in a way that is incompatible with long-term reciprocity? And then I would say, I wouldn't underestimate the genes, because I think that not only do they code for the aggressive impulses, which they clearly do, and the sexual impulses, which they clearly do, but I think they also code for behavioral patterns that represent the integration of those into a reciprocal game. I think we're sophisticated enough biologically for that. And that's why I think that that's why we have the capacity to admire high order ethical behavior. Now, there might be a bit of a competition, you know, so that the genes that control or bring about aggression have been around for so long and are so primordial and powerful that the biology that allows us to integrate and to recognize integration is of insufficient power to regulate them. That's a possibility. But I think that our biology, I think the biology of ethics is more sophisticated than mere inhibition.
Well, so, boy, there's a lot to say here. One, I think you're hearing echoes of the debate between Freud and Jung. I don't think the positions map. And what I would argue is that Freud clearly has something right with respect to inhibition. In some sense, human beings have a range of behaviors that they are endowed with genetically, and then the program that they acquire through nurture limits where those programs are deployed. It may turn certain programs permanently latent. And my point is That's a natural process. Jung is focused somewhere different, right? Freud is focused on the inhibition itself. And I must say, I'm not well versed in Freud, but with things like the Oedipal complex, the Electra complex, I believe he's got it dead wrong. He basically botched the job because he saw a pattern that he recognized, and in fact, it was a slightly different pattern. But we can return there later. My point would be, we have a natural process of those inhibitions being wielded in an ever more sophisticated way that does ever better sideline things like violence. Society is getting less violent. If you look over a long time scale, it's getting less violent in terms of your risk walking down the street, more tolerant, etc. But that the problem is that has functioned as a means to an end, and the end is a genetic one, even though we're not aware of it. If you look at society, any society, it may look increasingly peaceful, but in part, it's being increasingly peaceful on the inside is strengthening it for battle with other societies on the outside. And ultimately, we can't play that game forever, right? There are no new continents. Our weapons are too powerful. We are too interconnected. We are all bound together in one experiment. And if we continue to allow a dynamic that brought us here to rule, to govern our behavior, we will extinguish ourselves in short order. So my point is the genes and competition between lineages was good enough to generate all the amazing stuff that's built into humans. It also generated all the horrifying stuff. It is now time for us to choose between them because in some sense, we've run to the end of the tape. We have now gotten to a place where the game that brought us here will be fatal. We can say that with essentially certainty at this point because of the power of our tools, right? 500 years ago, a human population that was foolish could extinguish itself, but it couldn't extinguish humanity. And now we're at the point where a foolish population can take humanity out, and it's only a matter of time.
Maybe a foolish individual.
Yeah, even a foolish individual.
Well, increasingly we're moving to. Well, I certainly don't disagree with that. That danger. I guess I've always been attracted to the Jungian idea of integration of the shadow, and that is not an inhibition argument. It's an integration argument. And so I would say, rather than, and I think this is an important difference, is that there's lots of ways that you can be a warrior that are in keeping with reciprocity, but allow that fundamental motivational force to still have its say. Now, one of the things that I think capitalism is underappreciated for its vices. So it's better that warlike men establish mercantile empires than empires of war. And I think rather than the whole scale remodeling of our group, of our proclivity for group aggression, we need to figure out how to refine and orient it. So capitalism is a landscape of competition. It's not only that, because it's also a landscape of cooperation. And virtually everything we do is a landscape of competition and cooperation. But I see, for example, misguided efforts to insist that all games among children be cooperative as a way of dampening down the competitive impulse. And to me, that's going to make things worse rather than better. Now, I'm not saying that that's what you're aiming at, but look, we share a common view of this problem. The problem is that we've become so technologically powerful that our moral failings are increasingly fatal. Okay, so what do we do about that? Well, my answer to that, to the degree that I have one, is that, well, we learn to play the best of all possible games. And we bring all of that evolutionary heritage on board to play that game. And that's a that's a sublimation and a sophistication, and it's sort of Piaget rather than Freud in some sense.
Yeah, I would say I think we're in near perfect agreement here. We have to learn each other's language about it.
Yes.
But what I would say is, an explosion is a very dangerous thing, but it's a marvelous thing in a cylinder where it can be used to do physical work. And so the point is, let's not pretend that we are something other than we are, but let's take those impulses and channel them to something productive. And so this is actually
that's good, because I can bring that back to my book now, because that is really what I'm trying to do in these 3 books, is to say, well, look, don't underestimate your downside, your capacity for mayhem, but don't assume that makes you unredeemable. Don't be so afraid of it that you can't admit to it. That'll make it even worse. And find something better to do. We're jealous and resentful and vengeful and bitter and all of those things. And I also, especially in chapter 11 of the new book, try to explain why we have those motivations and why they're so powerful. Again, to give the devil his due. But to say nonetheless, well, we have to get beyond that, despite the reasons for our motives, for our dark motives.
Well, the thing is, we know that we are capable of marvelous things. And frankly, I don't think this puzzle is as hard as it seems if we set ourselves to it. If we're continually battling over whether or not it's real, then I don't think we're going to make it. But
okay, so let me offer you a practical problem. I've been talking to Bjorn Lomborg and Matt Ridley on my podcasts, and they're future optimists. Within a materialistic framework, fundamentally, both of them insist that things are not as dire as they're painted. But regardless of that, what they do point to, like Steven Pinker, I would say, is that we've made tremendous progress on all sorts of dimensions in the last 300 or 400 years.
How did the AI get all the way up here?
And there's every reason to assume that we could continue doing that over the next 100 years if we got our priorities straight. It's within our capability. That was blue. And so you can look at such things. And I think these are hard bits of data, although time frame is always a problem. There are far fewer people in abject poverty by proportion now than there were 40 years ago. And 40 years ago, there were much fewer than there was 100 years ago. And that trajectory appears to be continuing. We can continue to make incremental improvements in the material well-being of everyone. And there's limits, obviously, and the economists and the biologists argue about what those limits might be. But one of the problems with that view is that it's not saleable. It doesn't have, for some reason, it doesn't have the kind of motive power that enables people to get on board and get enthusiastic about it.
Well, I also don't think it's, I must say, I have mixed reactions. I'm a fan of Ridley's, not so much Lomborg's. And I have mixed feelings about Pinker's view. There's obviously some truth in it, but I believe it goes out of its way to miss the counter argument. And
well, it might. It might go out of its way to miss the, even from a rhetorical perspective. And, I would look at that symbolically. I would say, look, there's a tyrant and there's a wise king, and they're both there. And if you only look at the tyrant, that's the corruption of society, then you're missing half the story. And I would imagine that Pinker would say, well, people are looking at the tyrant so hard that we need to look at the wise king a little bit more.
Well, I would take a different approach to this. So I would argue that things have gotten better. The Pinker pattern is recognizable, but that it cannot be indefinitely extended. And that the limit is that we've come to a place where lineage versus lineage competition on a planet of this size with a population as large as we have and the technologies that we've got is a fatal proposition, almost no matter how it plays out. So in order to take the pattern that has continued to this point and extend it indefinitely into the future, you have to do two things. One of them we've already described, which is you have to take the genes out of the driver's seat, which is frankly in the long-term interests of the genes, but genes are too dim to see it, right? So we have to take effectively something like a Buddhist approach to long-term well-being. We have to become very dedicated to the idea of sustainability. And I realize how hard it is to operationalize an idea like that. But somehow we cannot keep degrading the planet and imagining that we're going to technologically rescue it.
Well, I hope your conscience does that, technically speaking. I mean, I'm dead serious about this because you just said something of crucial importance, and I think it's at the core. There's an argument that's always going on now between biologists and economists, I would say, that they're the two camps. And the economists say, human ingenuity can continually rescue us from whatever problems are likely to emerge. And the biologists say, well, never forget Malthus. And it's a matter of time frame, which is the argument you made. It's like, well, that's working now. You know, there's that famous bet between Paul Ehrlich and Simon. And Ehrlich wrote The Population Bomb, a very pessimistic book. And he believed at that point, 68, I think, that there would be mass starvation and a terrible shortage of material resources by the year 2000. And he had a famous bet with Simon, who was a genius in his own right, certainly the intellectual match for Ehrlich. And Simon said, no, I'll bet you that everything will be cheaper and people will be less hungry. And Simon won the bet. Now, of course, Ehrlich could say, yeah, well, I got it wrong by 50 years, or I got it wrong by 100. Time frames deadly. Yep. So, but okay, we can take time frames seriously. I've been taking this idea of an intrinsic, evolutionarily determined, biologically based ethic seriously. And I think that the voice of conscience is the voice of sustainability and iterability speaking within. And it's not overwhelming. It's not overwhelming because you have to sacrifice the future for the present fairly often. It turns out that way, right? Because you have to make snap emergency decisions that might not be in your best long-term interest, but the long-term interest speaks inside you.
Agreed. Agreed. And so, but less and less well as we have abandoned the mythology that used to undergird it. So as we have become more secular. Why would you say that? Why would you say that's a very interesting thing to say? Why do you believe that? Well, first of all, the problem with cultural evolution is that if we talk about genetic adaptations, you can look at virtually any creature, virtually any appendage, virtually any behavior in a non-human creature in its natural environment and be pretty sure it makes a good deal of sense, right? The stuff that didn't make sense got pruned away. It's not there to see. How it makes sense, that's a tough question, but whether it makes sense, not tough, almost ever. In human cultural evolution space, that is not the case, right? We have a huge amount of noise, stuff that will not stand the test of time, that nonetheless dominates our current cultural landscape. And so we can't go into it and assume these things make sense. So what I'm telling you is that, in my view, the religious mythology was doing jobs that we don't know. Some of them we can piece together. Some of them we'll never understand what the role of a particular mythological belief was. But what we have now is kind of an intermediate level of sophistication where we've gotten past some of the religious mythology, but without the wisdom necessary to replace it with anything that does the jobs that it was doing. And so we're now screwing up left and right, you know. That's the right way to put it, too, because most of this, what's happened is that functional mythology has been replaced by inadequate ideology. And the ideology, and I wrote about this in Beyond Order, there's a chapter called Abandon Ideology. I think of ideologies as parasites on a religious platform.
They have their power. The power they have is because they derive their power from an underlying mythological narrative structure, but they only tell half the story. If that's akin to that's an idea that's akin to the one that you just laid out.
Yeah, I think so. Although I think you're being generous to call it all ideology. I'd say some of it's just idiocy, right? We've replaced a structure that worked that is now not viable because it's not in the environment for which it adapted, but we've replaced it with something that doesn't stand any chance of working, and we keep one self-inflicted wound after the next. And either we're going to figure out that pattern and recognize that the function that we're using to generate the next level of behavior and culture is a lethal hazard, or it's going to take us out. So I would say the key, if I can go back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, the key to continuing the trajectory of improvement that has been recognized by Pinker and Ridley, at least, is to understand that it needs to be based on something else going forward, that the limits of the system that they are recognizing, we have to go through a revolution in the way we sustain ourselves. We cannot fuel it on lineage versus lineage competition. However, what we mustn't do is either create a stagnation that causes the human beings to react in the way that they do when they run against the limits of a landscape, a physical landscape, or run up against the limits of economic growth, both of which would be a disaster. So we have to create a steady state in which we don't degrade the planet, but we do give the human beings the sensation of living in a time of growth. That's going to be the key, right? Human beings, when they are
well,
involved...
I want to decorate that slightly. I mean,
Sure.
Part of the problem here too is that when you're absolutely deprived, having that deprivation remediated is powerfully motivating. But as the deprivation decreases, the motivating power of the remediation decreases. And so I would also say that arguing for the motivational viability of a more generous material landscape is also a game that is decreasing in its attractiveness. Because,
Right.
One of the things I realized a few years ago was that if you're stuck in traffic, it makes very little difference how expensive your car is. That we've hit the point where many people have enough so that having more isn't going to be of that much utility. And I'm not talking about people who are still absolutely deprived. And I understand full well that a large percentage of the population, decreasing though it may be, are still in a state of absolute deprivation. They're going to be motivated by the desire for material improvement, for sure. But those of us who are past that, and I would say that's virtually everyone in North America that isn't suffering for reasons that material cannot remediate. We're wealthy. We have heat. We have refrigeration. We have an infinite expanse of informational technology. That can all be improved, but the improvements aren't going to make that much difference. What's next? Like, what do you do when you have enough?
All right. So,
and you try to make everyone else have enough. That's something, right? That's something. And it's worth it. But even that that's happening.
Right. So I realized something over the last several weeks, which is that there's something that has bothered me about the way those of us who fear Marxism argue against it. It seems to me that we very frequently say things about how Marxism goes wrong. And these things, I would say them very somewhat differently than most people, but by and large, there's some direct connection between the attempt to create a Marxist utopia and starvation, authoritarianism, and I think I know what this is, and actually it goes back to the question of group selection, which is because these systems are game theoretically unstable, because they punish those who do more and reward those who do less, in order to get people who are harmed by that, that is to say, those who tend to contribute more and are therefore punished by such a system, to adhere to it, you have to threaten them.
Right. They're unplayable games. And you have to enforce them by force because people discover they're unplayable.
Right.
Yeah. So that unplayable game, I just want to elaborate that because you said game theoretic and you're going to lose, you'll lose a bunch of your audience because of that. But these are, and stop me if I mangle this, but game theorists are interested in the repeatability of interactions. And some forms of interactions degenerate with time. Those aren't sustainable. They're not good games. As you play them, you get bored by them or hurt by them. You don't want to keep playing. Some games maintain themselves. And I would say we have an ethic that teaches us when we're playing a sustainable game. I think that's the voice of conscience. That's related to the points I made earlier. Your Marxism, as it's instantiated, is actually an unplayable game. And you gave a reason, is that you can't set up a system that punishes people that are productive and rewards people who aren't, even if some of the people are only miming productivity and they're actually power-hungry tyrants. You can't clump them in with the competent people and punish all of them.
Yep. Now, and if you try, in order to stabilize it, in order to get those who are being punished for contributing not to defect, you have to threaten them so that authoritarianism follows quickly on the heels, as does in many cases the failure of the system to deliver even basic well-being, hence starvation.
Well, and Piaget pointed out quite explicitly, because he was very interested in games as the basis of morality, that a game that you have to punish people to adhere to is going to be outcompeted by a game that people will play by themselves.
Bingo.
Yeah.
So a natural ethic. So we make this argument, many of us who have this particular concern, we make this argument or some version of it. Here's the argument that I don't hear. The argument that I don't hear, but I'm certain that I believe and have believed all along, is that equality of outcome, even if you could achieve it, is in and of itself not desirable and certainly unjust.
I would love to talk about that.
I thought you might. So my argument is very simple, right? What you want is a system that leverages well-being in order to generate improvements. So in other words, you want the reward that comes from successfully competing to get individuals to contribute to collective well-being. The mythology. The mythology of our economic system is that you're being rewarded for delivering stuff that's good, and that's why you're wealthy, right? Now, it happens that our economic system does a terrible job of this. It enriches lots of people who are actually harming other people. But in principle, if you were economically rewarded for generating well-being, that would be a good thing. And it is desirable, therefore, that we have a system in which people who have contributed more have earned the right to live better, and people who have contributed less do not live as well, but live at a respectable standard.
And the Bitcoin people would really like to talk to you about this, I'm sure.
They have made themselves hard to talk to, I will tell you. But
yes, well, they're hoping it's incorruptible. It can't be gamed as easily. And it's an interesting argument. There's aspects of the argument that are very interesting.
Yes, they're certainly onto something. They seem to think they've found the ultimate solution to all sorts of problems, whereas I think they found a very promising avenue, but not a solution. I remain to be convinced of that. But in any case, the point is, on the left, you will very frequently hear that inequality is evidence of injustice.
Yes, I definitely wanted to return to that. So continue.
And this is not the case. A system in which people were armed with high-quality tools with which to compete in which competition rewarded behavior that contributed to our collective well-being and did not reward behavior where we harm each other, that would be a good system in which people would end up living unequally. Now, it might not be a massive level of inequality. It might be more limited. But nonetheless, the point is, those who would shoot for a system in which we all end up with exactly the same amount are actually setting us up for a despicable and unjust outcome. Whereas a system in which the ability to earn a higher quality of living is available to you and you have the tools with which to pursue it is a desirable system.
Okay, so let me add something to that.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, so it isn't that obvious when you're talking about outcome and when you're talking about right now. I don't mean you, I mean in general. So like you have an array of talents and abilities, and some of those are what you're going to use to pursue your outcome, but some of them are already outcomes. Okay, so it's not obvious what's the difference between an outcome and an ability. Now, you also want to, if everyone was equal, no one could trade because you wouldn't have anything to offer me. You have to offer me something I don't have. Now, you might say the fact that you have something I don't isn't an outcome, but I already said that what exactly constitutes the outcome is blurry. It's arbitrary. Now, all you have to bring to the world is what is unequal about you. And so and you'd think that people who push on the diversity end of things would recognize that above all else. And so by forcing equality, you actually destroy what everyone has to bring to the table to trade. And that's a terrible thing because you punish them then for the best thing they have. That's one terrible thing. But the other thing is you deprive everyone of the opportunity to benefit from everyone bringing what's unique about them to the table. So I would say there's a terrible contradiction between diversity as a value and equality of outcome as a desire. Those two things I don't see how they're logically commensurate.
That's a very interesting point. I really like it. That in effect, our collective well-being is a matter of the creation of wealth through the exchange, and the exchange inherently requires an inequality. Right?
Yes, and you even work for the inequality because let's say you're only as good as everyone else at everything. Well, then you're going to go out and educate yourself like mad about something until you're now a marketable commodity. And so you're making yourself, you're increasing the amount of inequality as a consequence, but that's actually a virtue, not a vice.
Another way of putting it is that in order for all of the jobs to get done that make us collectively robust and well off, people have to arbitrage things that are under valued. In other words, if there is a dearth of computer programmers, then it is your desire to get ahead that might cause you to go into computer programming, which is the force that ensures that there are enough computer programmers in the next round of the game. And if you don't have that motivation, because everybody has been slated for an equal outcome, then the point is there's no telling what you'll have too many of and too few of in the next round, because there's no reward for figuring out which thing is
well, worse even, there's a punishment for being exceptional, because your exceptionality exists in violation of the principle of equality.
Yes, it's the Harrison Bergeron dystopia. And so anyway, I didn't want to drag us too far down the road here, but I do want to say that I think both of these arguments against anything Marxist must be on the table, right? Not only does it devolve into something authoritarian and ineffective at feeding people, but it also wouldn't be desirable even if it didn't. It would be horrifying. And so I want to put that as a counterpoint to what I was arguing for before, which is in order for us to continue through the next several hundred years, let's say, and to continue to enjoy a high quality of living, we have to retool the objectives of the system so that they give the human beings the somatic sensations that they need. We have to feel that we are living in a time of growth because we will be less violent if we feel the sensation of growth. I think your point about integrating the dangerous components of the human psyche with the productive components is probably key to this as well. In other words, and in fact, we can see many examples of this, right? So, for example, if we look into the past, before widely available birth control, for example, before widely available birth control, women were wise to avoid engaging in behavior that might cause them to have to raise a child alone, because that's a very expensive mistake to make. The fact of women being careful about that made sexual relationships with women scarce. They had a high bar to them. And when they had a high bar to them, that created an awful lot of motivation for straight males to achieve things, right? And so the point is, okay, we pulled the plug on that system. Sex became common. People are now much more, or straight males are much less likely to have incentive to participate in the system. So maybe we've substituted a pure financial incentive for what was once a romance incentive, right? So that's one example. Another example might be the case of the way once upon a time corporations used to deal with their career employees, right, who came in at some rung of the ladder and every year or two was awarded a bonus or, a raise and an increase in the benefits that they had access to. And that creates a kind of sensation of growth, even if the economy was stagnant. And so in any case, what I'm arguing is that there have been things in the past that functioned so as to create the correct structure of incentives for a person so that they had meaning and direction in their life, so that basically by following a normal set of impulses, they ended up likely to contribute. And then what we've got now is effectively, very much to the title of your book, chaos, where following one's impulses is very likely to lead you to spend tremendous number of hours playing a video game that does not contribute positively to the world, but costs you, has an opportunity cost with respect to what you will learn and achieve.
So what do you think about this? I mean, I'd like you to answer this personally. I mean, you've made some costly decisions in the last few years, and they've had benefits. They've had benefits as well, but they've also had costs. My sense is that as we face an increasingly complex landscape and the consequences of our actions echo ever more powerfully around because of the technology, that the best place that we can start investigating to find out what the path forward might be is in more careful attention to the voice of, I said this already, conscience. Does that seem to you to be, because you said something abstract, we need this landscape to replace, to rectify the flaws in our current landscape. But getting from where we are to that point is a very difficult proposition. I've been criticized in my thinking because of my undue emphasis on the individual, especially by people, I would say, people who are more on the left, who maybe view things at a systems level more readily. Well, what about the role of government? What about the fact of inequities in society? shouldn't you be concentrating on movement at that level? And I think, well, all of that's changing extraordinarily rapidly as it is. There's no doubt that there's action at those levels that's necessary, but that doesn't seem to be what's particularly germane at the moment. Because I don't know where else we can turn for answers. I also turn to the past. I made the presupposition, which is something you laid out earlier, that if an animal species engages in a behavior consistently, you might start by assuming that there's something useful about it, even though you might not understand it. I made that assumption when I was looking at religious belief, because it was clear to me, and still is, as a biologist, that human beings have a religious instinct. We have the capacity for religious experience. And so dismissing all that out of hand because you're scientific actually seems to me to be a contradiction in terms. If you're a physicist, perhaps, and perhaps not, but if you're a biologist, well, no, wait a minute. You run into the problem of Darwin immediately. Human beings have a religious instinct. Why is that? Well, is it a spandrel? I don't think you should be allowed to define spandrels post hoc. I can't figure out why that's useful. Therefore, it's an evolutionary dead end. Perhaps not.
Well, the spandrel argument, it's funny. I was just writing about it a little bit this morning. But the spandrel argument is a red herring. Your argument is exactly correct. And in fact, I generated a 4-part test for adaptation to escape the spandrels argument many years ago.
Do you want to define spandrel just so that you don't lose people on that word?
Sure. Yeah, spandrel is an architectural consequence of placing a dome on columns. There are these sort of roughly triangular shapes, and there's a famous set of them in St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, which Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin used as the central metaphor in a paper that they wrote in 1979, which argued that evolutionary biologists were getting ahead of themselves and making up lots of stories to explain why this, that, and the other trait of creatures was adaptive when in fact they didn't have the logical basis to make that claim. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole set of counter arguments, but it's a nonsense argument on their part. There's like a grain of truth and then a whole lot of fiction stacked on top of it, which was interestingly deployed. Both Gould and Lewontin had Marxist sympathies, and there was this sense that, so this was the era in which sociobiology was taking off, and people were realizing just how powerful evolutionary thinking was in explaining human behavior. And Marxists don't like this idea at all. They fear it because...
Well, it means that human beings aren't infinitely malleable. Or that we have a nature and that has to be contended with.
That we have a nature and that we are not inherently equal, right? Because in order for this to be a consequence, in order for behavior to be a consequence of evolution, more effective behaviors had to outcompete less effective behaviors. More effective people had to outcompete less effective people. And so it runs counter to the Marxist sympathies. And so in effect, this paper, based on these spandrels, argued that evolutionists didn't have the evidence to claim adaptation except very rarely. So the idea
because a phenomenon could be the side effect of something that was selected for, and it hadn't been selected against yet, so it's there, but it's not because it evolved, so to speak.
Right. So if you were standing looking at, and maybe I took some pictures when I was in Venice recently, and I took some pictures of these spandrels for the purpose of talking about them on YouTube. And anyway, so these triangular spaces that are left when you place this dome on top of these columns have been filled with mosaics. In the central one, they've been filled with mosaics of the 4 evangelists. And so their point was you could look at these and you could say that the purpose of the spandrel is to house these mosaics, when in fact the spandrel is an accident and the mosaics are just something that opportunistically was placed there. So why did that come up here? We were talking about Oh, you were talking about religion and whether or not it was justified to imagine that it was serving some adaptive purpose by virtue of the fact that human beings seem to have a propensity for religious belief. And I 100% agree with this argument. I have made this argument myself. The cost of religion to humans is so great that it must be paying that and much more, at least historically, in order for it to have been a feature of every important civilization. So that argument is completely robust as far as I'm concerned. Now, I'm trying to recover. There was a thread that was the central argument that you were making has to do with, oh, yes.
I'm glad you got it.
Sometimes it's a mire of weeds, but okay. The point was this. You are sometimes taken to task for being overly focused on personal responsibility and neglecting the collective well-being functioning of society level. Now, as luck would have it, that was actually on my list of things to talk to you about today, because here's what I have learned as a lifelong liberal who has now gotten to an age where wisdom is beginning to dawn, is there is something about the personal responsibility argument that is absolutely essential. And there is a reason that it looms so large in the minds of so many high-quality thinkers, in spite of what it doesn't do. The reason is, if you're going to advise somebody or some small group of people on how to approach life, it's the slam dunk winner, right? It actually works. You do have power over yourself and how you interact with the world. So if you encounter a system that's very unfair, you can complain about the unfairness, and you have a very low chance of affecting it at all. Or you can say, well, it may be unfair, but I'm going to play the cards I've been dealt as well as I can. And that's something over which you have a tremendous amount of control. So I think there's a way in which just in terms of return on investment, there's almost no return on the investment in complaining about a broken system. There's tremendous returns to be had.
Well, it's especially true if you're not already competent and seen to be competent. Maybe you have some ghost of a chance of changing things if you are competent and are seen to be competent. But before then, you can break things, but building them, that's pretty damn hard.
Absolutely.
And you can work locally, and then you have some chance of success. And you can find out what is under your control. And then maybe you can turn yourself into someone who can make cautious systemic adjustments and have them be for the good rather than for harm.
Whereas if you take the other approach and you say, well, the system isn't fair, and I'm going to change the system, but you don't invest in your own competence, then A, you're unlikely to fix the system. But even if you do, you still don't arrive in it competent. And so you're still going to be outcompeted by people who did invest in personal responsibility. So in some sense, it's just a loser of a position from the point of view of an individual's allocation of their time and effort. On the other hand, let's say, I first started thinking about this when I encountered a number of Black conservatives who initially I didn't understand why there were Black conservatives, because it seemed like the system is unfair to Blacks. I know this to be true. And so putting the responsibility on the individual didn't make sense to me. But then I realized what I've just said to you, that from the point of view of helping people, this is the winner, as the argument goes, and the other one doesn't even work. But here's the problem with it. Let's say that you get the attention of a number of people who are deciding between whether to complain about the unfairness of the system or invest in personal responsibility, and you convince them that personal responsibility is the best answer. Okay? They will do better. They will do better at somebody else's expense. They will outcompete someone else. And it may be that you haven't increased the amount of wealth in their quadrant of the system at all. And so while you've given them good advice for not ending up at the short end of the stick, you didn't solve a problem. It just shifted where it went. So there is.
I think that would be more dangerous if personal responsibility was directly associated with like socioeconomic success as an infallible marker of that responsibility. It's partly why I try to concentrate more on ethical behavior and grounding responsibility in that, because I think that I don't think that you have to gain at the expense of other people if you play the game properly. I think you can gain. It's hard, and it's hard to do this, but you can play the game so that the people around you benefit at the same time you do, and that's actually a better game anyways, even for you. And I know that can run into zero-sum problems, but no matter what you do, it can run into zero-sum problems. I think it has the best chance of minimizing those zero-sum problems over the long run. So you play the game and you don't cheat. So if you're going to be a plumber, then you're a good plumber. And that's good because no one wants their basement full of sewage. It doesn't hurt anyone. You outcompete some of the plumbers who aren't doing so well.
So I agree with you completely. You can generate some wealth by increasing your capacity, which means it's not zero-sum. You ultimately may run into a zero-sum game in which the fact is somebody's going to be the loser.
Part of the reason that I wrote the second book, Beyond Order, was to state something like, look, try to be successful, try to be responsible. But if you find out that you're being successful in a zero-sum game and your success is at the expense of someone else, then you change the system.
Perfect.
That's why it's Beyond Order. It's like, because your point is something like, well, if the game is unfair and you're good at it, then you just get better at exploitation. It's like, right. Of course, systems can be corrupt. And then if you're a good player in that game, then you're the best at being corrupt. But that's the situation where you have an ethical obligation to move beyond your responsibility and to adjust the game. That's how it looks to me.
Right. Oh, no, we've landed in exactly the same place. That's the point, is that the problem is that the system is effectively in breach of contract, which doesn't say anything at all about whether or not your best move is to complain about the system or invest in your personal capacity.
I would say it's also an eternal truth that the system is in breach of contract. That's an existential reality. It's always now to a greater or lesser degree. Because there are systems that are completely unplayable and there are systems that are relatively playable. But the idea that your conscience should be bothered by the corruption of the system is like absolutely true. But that doesn't mean that you should go making incautious changes as a consequence of resentment.
Right. So now the present looks so insane from this perspective that you and I appear to share, right? Where we are now educating children ever younger in obsessing about defects of the system, many of them imaginary, right? Rather than giving them competence. In fact, we are demonizing the very acquisition of competence.
Perfect. That's exact. So that's something that needs to be broadcast everywhere. I think that the pathology that's at the core of the culture war is an attack on competence itself. It's an attack on competence, the idea of competence as well. That's why the critiques of meritocracy emerge, or that's at least part of the motivation for that. And everyone, you can say, well, look, do you rise according to your merit? It's like partly, okay, partly. And corruption reduces the correlation. But to say partly and to admit to the existence of some corruption is not the same thing at all as to say merit itself is a corrupt idea.
Right.
That's a completely different set of propositions with completely different outcomes.
Totally agree. And so we are constantly in this battle where if we say anything in defense of the idea of merit or meritocracy, we are understood to have claimed that we live in a meritocracy, and what's more, a perfect one. And then this is used to remove any impulse towards the acquisition of capacity. And to do this to children is so
terrible. It's terrible.
Yes, it's
the worst of all possible things you can do to children, because you punish them for their virtues.
Right. You're not giving them brain damage. You're giving them mind damage. You're damaging their minds.
Well, I looked at what happened in Boston this week so a number of the schools for the gifted my understanding is, were closed down because of racial inequality in their makeup. And I thought, well, it's obviously an undesirable, it's obviously problematic. But why should I assume that the motives of those who shut down the gifted system is the remediation of racism rather than an assault on the gifted? Because it's them that suffer immediately for it.
Right.
Now, maybe that's unfair, but I can't help but think that what we are seeing in the guise of virtue is an assault on the idea, an assault on competence. The thing is, competence presupposes value, and value presupposes a hierarchy. So if you admit to competence, you admit to a value hierarchy and differential ability. And that flies in the face of equality. So
I completely agree. And the obvious answer, of course, is irrespective of how unfair the system is, you should invest in your own competence. You should make use of what tools you have. And then we collectively ought to democratize the tools as well as we can.
Yes.
Because society is clearly best, and it is the morally only acceptable thing for everyone to have. Well,
it's even the only self-interested thing.
Ultimately.
I would rather that you were more competent. Now, if you're head-to-head in a competition with me, I might let resentment, allow me to desire your destruction. But all things considered, if you're competent, well, great, then you're going to offer me something. Okay, so we could agree, perhaps, that there is an element of the war on competence. That's the pathological end of this culture war that we're seeing. And we should also say that there's no doubt also a fair bit of attempts to rectify the terrible consequences of power-based inequality, right? So the good is intermingled with the bad, but we have to pay attention to the bad. Then another question would be, and I don't know the answer to this at all, if we're seeing the rise of something like a war on competence, why are we seeing it? And why now?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Let's put it this way. I do not know of any evidence that it is our global enemies seeding this, but they could hardly have done better, right? Were they to try to get us to sabotage ourselves, they could hardly have done better than to get us to demonize our own competence and to sabotage our own children. I mean, the thing that I can't get over is, all right, if we woke up and came to our senses tomorrow, how long would it take for all of the nonsense to clear the system and for us to get back to the level of competence that we were headed towards? I mean, we're talking about, the arguments have gotten particularly stupid in the last couple of years, but the overarching degradation of the system by those who didn't believe in competence in the first place goes back decades and has had a tremendous effect. And you know what? The bridges aren't falling down yet, not in large numbers, but that's by virtue of the fact that they were built by competent people and they don't require, yearly maintenance. And this is going to catch up to us. It is time for us to return to our senses and get back to business right quick, or we are going to leave ourselves vulnerable to people who care so much less about freedom and about justice than we do.
I'm trying to understand again why this might be occurring. I mean, one possibility, Brett, and this would be something interesting to consider, at least briefly, is like, do you trust your sampling of the data that indicate this is happening? You and I are in a particular position, and we share it. We're going to be much more sensitive to that kind of information, and we're going to be provided with it preferentially by other people. Now, I look and I see, especially what's happening in the education system. For example, I saw the some curriculum material for anti-racist math, claiming, for example, that getting the right answer was indicative of white supremacist culture domination, and so was showing your work. Ridiculous propositions. But then, I don't know how widespread that material is. I don't know how influential it is. I don't know who to trust to report on those things to me. And I don't know how to escape from what might be the bubble that I'm in because of my particular situation. So, thoughts on that?
Oh, many. There's no good way of doing the analysis because what we have is sampling bias everywhere. And what's worse, it's not even consistent because we don't know how the algorithms are modified, when they're changed, in what way they're changed. It's a moving target. On the other hand, the material you're referencing with respect to mathematics, showing your work, focusing on the right answer, etc., being somehow associated with white supremacy, that was funded by the Gates Foundation.
I know.
So that tells you something,
and it's
right
apparently backed by many influential school boards. And I've seen that the same ideas pop up in the tweets of public school superintendents commonly. Where generally, one of the things that's so amazing about that, I saw one of the superintendents in Michigan had posted an image of a blackboard with some of those propositions on it. And there must have been 400 comments, some hundreds of comments about that, all negative.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, if I was the person that posted that and I got 400 negative comments, I'd be so shell-shocked I wouldn't be able to leave the house for like a month. And I mean that, So I think, well, how can you post something like that and then get 400 negative comments with nary a positive one, because that was really the case, and not think maybe I made a mistake? What do you do? Do you spin into a conspiracy theory at that point and say, well, this is a coterie of people that are targeting these ideas and it's not representative of the general population? I have no idea what hoops you'd have to jump through.
As you will recall, all of these tropes about white supremacy and evidence and merit, they all involve these tricks to prevent you from discovering the truth, right? So the idea that to ask for evidence of racism is a booby trap. It's a Kafka trap. And what it means is that somebody who believes this stuff and then gets a whole lot of pushback has 5 categories with which to dismiss it, right? So whereas you or I might hit a particular sensitive note and say, well, that's flack over the target, right? I'm pretty sure I got close to something because of the reaction I got. Well, that requires a certain amount of care that you do it only honorably, only when it's justified. But somebody else who regards any negative response.
But I also look at proportions, like if I put up a YouTube video,
right,
I actually attend to likes versus dislikes. I read through the comments and, I'm not happy when 5% of them are negative, and that's so far, thank God, that's about as high as it gets. Some of them are very vitriolic that are negative, and they certainly affect me, but I'm very sensitive, I believe, emotionally to that kind of quantity feedback as well as quality.
Well,
that's partly how you keep yourself oriented in the world by.
Of course, but you're actually looking to calibrate something. You're a scientist and you're looking to understand what the actual information is and to, sort the signal from the noise. Somebody who's interested in advancing a position might have a mechanism for dismissing the signal. But the answer to your first question, which I believe is very important, and I'm glad you asked it, about, well, how reliable? Because I inhabit a position in the universe that might cause me to see all of that evidence, and I might be misunderstanding how ubiquitous it is. The fact is there's lots of evidence that it's ubiquitous. For example, in the U.S., and I assume in Canada, every parent I know with kids in school is facing that school now passing on disinformation about the nature of American history, about the relations between people of different races. School names are being changed. This is taking place in every school of ed. It is apparently taking place, as much as I never would have predicted this, it is taking place across corporate boardrooms, right? And the thing that
for evil capitalists, they're sure not very good at defending themselves. They have no idea, no imagination for what kind of fifth column they're allowing to emerge, and how pernicious that's going to be.
What little information I have about what's really going on there, it sounds like they are actually being persuaded of this nonsense, which I find...
Well, I think guilt. A lot of it's guilt. It's like guilt is a very powerful motivator, especially for people who are essentially ethical. You know, and you might say, well, corporate leaders aren't essentially ethical. It's like, no. Just hold on a minute. If you look at what predicts success in business, it's intelligence and conscientiousness, just like in science. So it's intelligence and hard work / ethics. That doesn't mean everyone who's successful is ethical, but you can't point to success and say, well, that indicates a lack of ethics, unless the system is entirely corrupt.
I agree.
I think it's guilt. It's like, well, it's guilt, and it's failure to pay attention, especially to the long term, underestimation of lack of knowledge about what's underneath all this. But then again, maybe that's just my paranoid perspective, and yours too, because we see these things. Well, that's the thing. You see these things and you think, no, there's something lurking there.
Well, at the very least, I think what we can say is this. It is entirely possible for a person to get the wrong impression about how ubiquitous a movement is or how far its influence stretches, but that we can check this in a number of places. It appears to be every major college and university. It appears to be almost every corporation. It is every tech platform.
It's certainly every faculty of education.
Every faculty of education.
Certainly that. And that's not good.
It appears to be nearly every high school. It appears to be driving the ascendant political party in the U.S. So how many of these things have to be true before we simply accept that for whatever reason, this movement is incredibly powerful at the moment? That this is not our imaginations. This is not us looking at a biased sample and overreacting to it. The evidence is this is it is controlling many of the levers that dictate the way resources are to be distributed, and that I think anyone who doesn't see the pattern is a fool not to be frightened.
Well, that doesn't help me escape from my bubble, does it?
Oh. Well, I don't know. I mean, there's an awful lot of power just simply between the Democratic Party, the tech platforms. Oh, we didn't even mention all the major news media. Well, there are a couple of exceptions. Obviously, the Wall Street Journal is an exception. Fox News is an exception. And, certainly exceptional stories show up in mainstream news media. But again, the preponderance appears to have been persuaded of this. So I think to the extent that one can peer outside the bubble and see the same thing that one sees from within the bubble, it looks like this is as concerning as we would tend to suspect.
Well, that's too bad. I would rather be wrong and this to be an illusion than to be right and for it to be the current reality.
I wholeheartedly agree with that.
I also think, optimistic as I am about the possibility of what we could all accomplish over the next 100 years, I don't think we're nearly at the end of this, because it seems to be accelerating to me. And the claims get more and more outrageous, and the amount of resistance gets smaller and smaller. You see some exceptions to that. I mean, a lot of journalists have abandoned the New York Times and have hit Substack.
Yes.
And they seem to be eking out an independent existence there. And so that looks potentially promising, that sort of thing.
Well, I think it is promising, and I think hopefully we will see more of this. In some sense, we are going to need parallel institutions. If we cannot retake the institutions that exist, we're going to need parallel ones in order to fight back, and ultimately, we're going to have to.
You mean like this podcast?
Right. Exactly.
Yes. Well, that's working, isn't it? That's another example of what's working.
I agree. Which makes it worrisome that we now see an instinct towards censorship and the policing of viewpoint on the...
Yeah, well, it certainly made me nervous. I've had conversations on my podcast recently that made me very nervous. And, I've been hit enough times, I would say, so that I don't have quite the resilience that I once had. And it doesn't seem to have stopped me from doing this, but it certainly made it harder to do. Did you see what happened to Dr. Seuss today?
Oh my goodness. Yes, I did. And it was obviously only a matter of time, but it's hard to imagine that we're here. I mean, it's not that there's nothing to the claim. Obviously, there are some early cartoons that are disturbing, but it's not like he defended those cartoons. He apologized for them. He appears to have grown up, and the idea that we're going to deny children the Cat in the Hat because in the 1920s, Dr. Seuss made unfortunate cartoons is preposterous. And I would also say,
well, if only those who are sin-free are allowed to contribute, we're going to be in real trouble, because my sense is that creative people are just as flawed as everybody else, and that's flawed a lot, or maybe even more flawed sometimes, because they can be creative in their flaws.
I think that's true. I also, as long as you raise it, I just want to say one other thing about Dr. Seuss, which is the cartoons that are troubling are, they are real, and the disturbance at them, I understand. I feel it too when I look at them. But I also know that human beings are wired to caricature members of other populations, and that's not a good thing. But we've also gotten over it. Right? The fact that you find Disney cartoons that characterize or that caricature Chinese people and blacks and everyone else, the point is we have understood that this is bad and we've stopped doing it. And that's honorable. And to go back and punish people from the period before it was understood to be bad as if they were living in the present is obviously absurd, just as it is absurd to pull down statues of Abraham Lincoln because, he did not have a modern view of racial equality, right? It's nuts. We have to stop behaving this way. But I don't know why I'm telling you that. You know that as well as anyone.
So, well, that was good.
Yep, that was good. Sorry it went so long, but I got to say it's been incredibly enjoyable, and I certainly hope...
Wore me to a frazzle.
All right. Well, I look forward to our next conversation whenever that may happen. Thank you so much for joining me on the Dark Horse podcast. Jordan, your book, you want to hold it up again? Here we go. Beyond Order. And it is available as of today, which is March 2nd. I recommend everyone get a copy.
It's #1 in Australia.
All right. Hey, while we've been talking, it may be #1 in other places.
Canada.
All right.
Yep. So,
excellent. Well, I'm looking forward to reading it.
And it says Beyond Order, not Destroy Order.
Good.
Right.
Glad you clarified that.
Okay.
Okay, right, Jordan.
Really
thanks
good
so much.
talking to you. Yeah. Bye. Bye.
Be well.
Yay! I'm bloody one on expert. I tried to play multiplayer, but no one was around to play, so went ahead and played single player instead. I think I prefer expert to impossible actually, because impossible it's a little bit random, eh? If you don't start in the exact right spot, you could just be surrounded by really tough guys and you can't even move sometimes. At least on the expert you kind of got a chance. That's fun.